Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Hi, everyone. I'm Alexandria Miller, and thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture. Being that it is March, happy Women's History Month, as well as a fabulous International Women's Day. With this in mind, of course, we had to celebrate the auspicious, fearless women of the region with today's episode. Joining Strictly Facts for the first time is fellow doctoral student Sarah Ann Gresham. So before we begin, Sarah, do tell our listeners a bit about yourself, especially where in the Caribbean is near to you, and of course, what led to your work supporting women's rights in the region.
Of course. Thank you so much, Alexandria, for having me on your amazing podcast. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Ann Gresham. I am from Antigua, born and raised. I attended the Antigua Girls High School, and I also went to the Antigua State College, after which I attended the University of the West Indies in Cave Hill, Barbados, where I pursued a bachelor's degree in French and literatures in English. Between my bachelor's degree and my master's degree, I started a feminist Caribbean collective called Intersect Antigua with Enika Nicholas, who's also from Antigua. And we started this group to raise awareness and agitate for gender justice on a range of different topics germane to Caribbean feminist liberation. And that includes agitating for justice against queerphobia, which is enshrined in our legislation, also against gender-based violence and other really serious matters that disproportionately impact women in Antigua and Barbuda and the wider Caribbean region.
Thank you. And I'm so grateful to have you on the podcast as well. I'm sure we'll get into a lot about Intersect in a minute. One thing I really wanted to start our conversation off with is the fact that, I've termed part of the title of this episode Caribbean feminism, right? Hopefully, in a sense, to change the conception about what the term, particularly feminism, means. I think it's often codified a lot of times, especially referring specifically to global northern women's rights movements. And we don't always think about what that has looked like for us in the Caribbean, for women of color, for Black women. The list can sometimes go on. And I think especially those movements in the global north have oftentimes ignored or just, downright discarded women of color, their contributions and their interest needs, things of that nature. So that being said, I wanted to really call attention to the tremendous women-led movements within the Caribbean region that really deserve to be accounted for. So for one, I think of the innumerable women whose rebellious acts, and I count rebellious acts in a very broad way, right? It's not just being on the front lines necessarily, but I think of the rebellious acts of women who helped move the needle towards emancipation, or the working class women who led, participated, and supported the labor strikes of the early 20th century, particularly in the Anglophone Caribbean, right? So individuals like laundress turned labor activist Aggie Bernard, who fed strikers during the 1938 Kingston waterfront strikes. Those are people who come to mind, right? She was, at the time, helped feed all of the strikers during this really critical moment and continued to support trade unions for over the next 30 years. I don't think this necessarily gets called attention to as much, but the latter 20th century movement, which I think were tremendous decades, especially for women's activism against sexism and trade unions for one, also legal protections, right? There's been a lot of conversation, particularly in Jamaica, around maternity leave policies that have now evolved into parental leave to also include fathers, et cetera. But some of those policies really stemmed from, that early 70s, 80s, 90s period. And so these are all things, in my view, that I think make up this Caribbean feminist history that we oftentimes don't fully account for. So I just wanted to start off with that and ask you, Sarah, and how do you define Caribbean feminism and what you think the role of feminism has played in Caribbean politics?
Sure. And thank you for that really rich overview of the incredible work and movements of rebellious Caribbean women. I don't think that there is a monolithic definition of Caribbean feminism that I can point to. And so I can only gesture to a plurality of Caribbean feminisms with multiple, sometimes intersecting, sometimes diverging political commitments. And so for me personally, Caribbean feminisms should constitute, at the very least, to echo Jamaica Kincaid, a demanding relationship to history. And so in A Small Place, she talks about the fact that, knowing the way we are, why we do the things we do, why we live the way we live, and in the place we live, why the things that happened to us happened. And so while Jamaica Kincaid's Jeremiah in A Small Place might not fit onto a very neat political grid of intelligibility that we can, use, I still find it helpful for developing a strong political sensibility of knowing that we are still living within the long shadow of coloniality and other overlapping systems of oppression that continue to stratify and imperil all of us, but mostly women, especially Caribbean trans women and Caribbean people across the region. And so Caribbean feminisms, for me, describes a strong political sensibility and praxis that identifies and dismantles these systems of oppression. And it reimagines an otherwise beyond the prevailing structures that harm us. Another thing that I want to say is that Caribbean feminisms should always already be queer. And so I often say Caribbean feminisms instead of Caribbean feminisms to reflect a different relationship to power and a commitment to different arrangements of being human that depart from heteronormativity. So we're like moving away from, these inherited colonial ontologies of what it means to be human and imagining ourselves, constituting ourselves differently outside of these prevailing structures and norms.
One thing you also said that brought to mind is the fact that in kind of similar ways, if we're to juxtapose to the global north, right, we in the Caribbean are a multiracial society, right? And so there are several scholars that have written about this, which I, of course, can link for our listeners that have talked about, to your point, Caribbean feminisms also then needs to take into account the differences that, Afro-Caribbean women versus Indo-Caribbeans needs may differ or be the same in that sense, right? So there are so many pluralities for us to take account when we take into just understanding what these women's movements look like and what are the needs, the growing evolutions of them based off where we come from, identity, etc. Maybe even pointing to that question, how have you seen Caribbean or Caribbean feminisms in to use your term, being similar or even different to sort of global feminist movements?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'll say it's a term that I encountered elsewhere. So it's not one that I coined by any means, but I find it to be a really helpful reframing. I think that Caribbean feminisms help to shape US feminisms, contrary to the, commonly held assumptions that feminism is a corrupting global north import or influence. And we hear so many people in our lives in the Caribbean women saying, "Oh, that's a white people thing," or that's a global north thing. When, as Gabrielle Hossein who is an Indo-Caribbean feminist based in Trinidad and Tobago, we always had our own history of Caribbean feminist movements in the region that are in many ways distinct from that of the global north. But I also don't want to draw hard lines in the sand. And so there are many instances in which, as I mentioned before, Caribbean feminisms influence US-based feminisms. And so we have figures like Audre Lorde, we have June Jordan, we have so many people in the region today, myself included, yourself included,
which is right,
who bring our Caribbean feminist epistemologies into these spaces. And so we are shaping our pedagogy with Caribbean feminist thought, which then these pedagogies touch the students that we are engaging with. And, I also think that a lot of people believe because we are small, we are always being shaped by larger hands, but we are in a reciprocal relationship with the rest of the world. And so we are always, yes, being shaped and shaping other communities. And in this context, the US, where both of us we're currently located in.
Also wanted to nod to Claudia Jones, of course. I've had an episode on her before if you want to go check out that one. But I always almost, to your point, think of Claudia Jones as one of those key figures. Also, we can point to the Garvey women as well. Like, the list can go on and on, but several women who are from the Caribbean or were from the Caribbean who, then lived abroad and influenced tremendous movements, women's movements, Black women's movements, Pan-Africanist movements, etc., really helping to shape what that looks like abroad and in the diaspora, who
Yeah.
oftentimes don't even get acknowledged in the same way to maybe either male counterparts or, sometimes that critical point of where they come from sometimes gets lost in the historiography, for lack of a better way of framing.
Yes, yes.
Oftentimes, we even look at, in sort of my summation of what I think really critical points of 20th century women's movements and women's activism in the Caribbean looked like, I don't think we always cross over and consider the parallels between 20th and 21st century, especially because I think the term feminism in itself, particularly to the Caribbean, really started to gain traction heading into the 21st century. I think it's something a lot more now that I'll see being used, but maybe not as much so in the 21st century. So could you talk a bit about, what you've seen as major concerns between the 20th and 21st century and how you have seen them taking shape differently based off the time periods?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I will say that, in addition to the movement work and activist work that you outlined in your introductory comments about rebellious Caribbean women, I want to say that in terms of the concerns of the 20th century, I would say actually that many of the concerns spill over into the 21st century. And so they include violence against women, they include workplace harassment, they include, you mentioned like workers' unions and workers' strikes and so on. I can't point to any specific examples where there are discontinuities between what happened in the 20th century and what happened in the 21st century. I will say, though, that Caribbean liberation has figured more prominently in the 21st century in terms of Caribbean feminist activism. And so you'll definitely see a lot more organizations grounding their work in queer liberation and not just focusing on cis women or a very heteronormative framework in their gender equity or gender equality efforts, which I hold in a lot of tension, and I have a lot to say about gender equality and women as a category that we rally around to begin with. And so in the Caribbean region, we had a lot of, I guess I can use Antigua as an example specifically. We had a women's desk that was established in 1980 to see to the concerns of women as a group. So women as a group were being recognized by the state. And of course, we were very newly independent, quote unquote, because the Queen is still on our currency, and that's another conversation for another day, perhaps. And so in 1980, the women's desk was established. And then the name changed from the Women's Desk to the Directorate of Women's Affairs in 1985, and then eventually the Directorate of Gender Affairs. And so a lot of the concerns that this national machinery, as it is called, includes gender-based violence. That's one of the main concerns that also has echoes in other national machineries or women's desks around the Caribbean region. And so we've had like strategic action plans to end gender-based violence. We've had country gender assessments. We've had CEDAW reports before the year 2000. And so we would have these reports and people would go to the CEDAW committee and report on our progress to realizing the goals of gender justice and so on and so forth. And so, yeah, these were and continue to be some of the main concerns. And today, there's the 16 Days of Activism to End Gender-Based Violence campaign that takes place every year, starting from the 25th of November to January 10th, which is Human Rights Day. And so, yeah, there are a lot of continuities. I think that the state is less committed to queer liberation than the grassroots organizations. And so you'll see in these grassroots organizations more people rallying around a queer politic that the state isn't necessarily as kosher about because of, you know, its commitment to coloniality. And so we have queerphobia enshrined in our legislation that constitutes an ongoing struggle with activists against governments.
You know, to your point, right? A lot of that, particularly latter 20th century movement work, really laid the foundation for a lot of the issues that we're taking up and that continue to be taken up today. But in a lot of ways, I think one really distinction for me is this digital age, right? We can't negate the fact that like the digital age enables us to connect with each other for this mobilization in a very integral way. I mean, there are so many names we could mention, right? But the stark list of women who have been lost to gender-based violence, right? It's a whole nother, you know, measure to take into account when we can connect Jamaica and Trinidad and Antigua and so forth based off Twitter and
Right.
Instagram and all of these things taken together. I also want to sort of make note of, I think maybe even like a deeper lexiconography of how we understand these issues in a sense, right? I think to an extent, there's a deeper discussion about how value and women's values, et cetera, have been placed. I think a lot of so much work around care work, particularly how that has been categorized as not just an issue. You know, I think of like Red Thread in Guyana in particular, that care work is often gendered, right? It's
Yes.
women's work, particularly, and that we've been able to constitute more about how that, you know, impacts women, the roles that they can take up, the labor. It is a labor, right? You know, at one time, maybe it would have just been like, yeah, this is a woman's thing to take care of a family, so forth and so forth. But we've been able to really, most recently in the 21st century, even just estimate the cost, like not just the cost of like the wear and tear, et cetera, but
Mm.
also the literal like financial burden that that costs for women as well. And I think in a lot of ways, being able to connect our islands, our states, our, you know, bodies, even though we've been separated by waters, is one really key pinpoint that I think is, I mean, obviously a beautiful thing in terms of how we are understanding ourselves. But again, still, right, like we have so much more to do and so much further to go. But I definitely do think the digital age is one of the key things that I've always really cherished, especially living in the diaspora and still being able to support the work on the ground and, you know, support grassroots organizations that I may not, you know, be able to be in contact with in that same way personally as well.
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning that. And so a lot of the issues persist today, but as you mentioned, the internet creates a new medium
Mhm,
whereby we can, as you said, connect, we can forge solidarity
mhm,
across difference, across geographic boundaries. And so Intersect Antigua, the Caribbean Feminist Collective that I co-founded with Anika Nicholas, is an example of, I guess I can frame it as a child of the digital revolution. And so we have benefited in that we have been able to continue the work despite us not being in the same place all of the time. even when we were in Antigua, we were able to reach communities that we would not have been able to reach in person, even though we're on the ground, especially queer Antiguan communities, people who are not yet out and people who, want to maintain some semblance of anonymity, considering, discrimination, queerphobia, transphobia that they would face otherwise. And so, yes, it has been an incredibly helpful organizing tool. And thank you for bringing that up. And then you mentioned care work and the care economy and women's unpaid reproductive labor that's necessary for capitalism to sustain itself. And yeah, it absolutely, as a lot of feminist economists and even people who are not feminist economists have pointed out, it contributes a significant amount to a given nation's GDP, even though it's not formally counted as such. It has tremendous monetary value. But, capitalism forces women to do that work, to reproduce the labor force, and that work is always unpaid. And of course, we can talk about like differences in the US and in the Caribbean. Black women in the US have always had to work both in and outside of the home. And so they have that, quote unquote, double shift. In the Caribbean, it's the same thing as well. Like we've always had to, shoulder that burden of unpaid reproductive labor at home. And we always had to go out to work, contrary to, middle class white women who were more likely to be confined at home. And then the care work extends to feminist movements because a lot of the activist work that we do constitutes a form of care work, a form of caring for communities, a form of agitating for justice in light of the many overlapping issues and perils that they face. And so much of this organizing work, so much of this movement building work, they're unpaid work, unpaid labor, once again, and women predominate in these movements. So it's again a continuation of the informal economy, the informal sector, the gray economy, where women are doing all of this important, necessary labor to sustain communities, and they're not being compensated for it. And I think that's by design because people get burnt out. And if you're too tired to agitate for justice, then, what are you going to do?
What you were saying even led me to how imperialism and capitalism then takes this care work issue to the diaspora as well, right? So it's always made me cringe, but I don't know how many movies I've watched and they've had the helper, as we would say, or the nanny, etc., in maybe New York or whatever. It's always someone who's not actually Caribbean and has very terrible Caribbean accent. But the point being, right, that, that's a very systemic way that we show up and that care work then becomes this global phenomenon, right? We're not just doing this labor in the Caribbean, but then also when women are trying to support their families and go abroad, whether that's Canada, the UK, the US, etc., that creates a whole nother system of issues where they're caring for people abroad. Oftentimes their children are left back home on the island. It's another cycle of problems, I think, that, oftentimes don't always get put in the same sort of box sometimes.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, it also happens within the Caribbean region when we look at class differences. And so
Mhm.
we have like European descendant people or Americans who reside in the Caribbean, or even Black people in the Caribbean, Antiguans, Bajans, and so on. But because of their class privileges, they're able to hire other women from maybe the Dominican Republic, for instance, who come to the Caribbean region to take care of our children. And so we're perpetuating and reproducing these same, systems of inequality. And so we don't always have to look for the global, like examples where it's people from the global south going to the global north. It also happens within our geographic region as well.
Definitely. I think one thing I also, in the same breath, wanted us to gesture towards is talking about rights. how they show up in the region, how they're gendered even, and what tensions arise because of them as well.
Yeah, I think that this is something that we need to talk about a lot more in the region, because we kind of hold up rights as this sign of progress that's not often subject to critique within certain spheres of Caribbean feminisms. Of course, there has always been a critique levied by folks like Professor Eugene Baratow and Dr. Tanya Haynes and Dr. Halima Deshang and so on and so forth. But I think it's also really important to have these conversations where it's happening. And so, for instance, a lot of Caribbean feminist organizations are, and governments, of course, because of their obligations to, certain international conventions and so on, like CEDAW, getting rights is often seen as like the apotheosis of gender equality and progress and all of these things. And so I remember listening to Professor Udine Baratow talk about that within the framework of gender equality. And so what does it mean when we say that we want equality with men? What does it mean that we want inclusion into certain structures and systems and so on? And I found that to be a really helpful framing. And so I worked at the Directorate of Gender Affairs for a few years, and I had to co-edit the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination, which is CEDAW. And so, I went on to get my master's degree in gender studies, and now I'm doing my PhD. And when I revisited CEDAW, I was really confronted by what I read after having, gone through grad school, read the literature, engaged with people who critiqued gender equality and so on. And so I was confronted by a lot of the fissures that precluded a fully realized knowing about what it really means to be a rights-bearing subject, that's often like pining and agitating for equality with men. And so at first I was like, okay, well, why is it wrong to correct egregious legal, institutional, and cultural barriers that preclude women's full civic participation? And so I realized that the problem lied within my framing of the discontent harbored by some feminists toward the notion of equality, and in my knowledge gaps about liberalism and liberal feminism. And so when I went to the Caribbean Institute for Gender and Development in Barbados, while I was working at the Directorate of Gender Affairs, I was taught by Dr. Haynes, I was taught by Tracy Robinson, I was taught by Dr. Halima Deshang, by Dr. Crawford, and all of these amazing Caribbean feminist thinkers who taught all of us, all of the participants, about liberalism and about liberal feminism. And we have to reckon with the fact that inclusion within systems and within frameworks that are themselves problematic should never be the goal. And so what does it mean to want to be equal with men within these frameworks or within these systems that are inherently causing harm? And so we can't only seek representation, we can't only seek inclusion. Sure, those things in and of themselves can be nice, but if we are seeking inclusion within a framework or within a system that is itself really problematic, then I'm not sure, how we are getting closer to achieving justice. And so people often talk about equality versus equity, but I think that equality in and of itself needs to be critiqued even more.
Definitely, it's not just the case of like, should we have one woman for every one man in parliament, or, what those sort of things look like. For a lack of a better example, right, having President Barack Obama for the US did not necessarily cure like racial issues, for example. So if we take that parallel, it's sort of the same thing. Some of those points that we make that you've made around equality don't necessarily equate to things working in a very just way. I also oftentimes think of Professor Kamala Kempedu's work on sex work as very integral to understanding why some people end up in certain situations or, choose certain forms of labor. But, they are also challenged in the system of coloniality, of statehood that deems their work illegitimate and problematic, etc. Also, then add in the sort of religious angle as well. That these things are all like multifaceted problems that oftentimes affect the most marginalized, which tend to be women, queer people, etc. And we definitely, to your point, need to reshape what we think of as people being equal or what is just work in the Caribbean.
Yeah, and I remember us having a conversation earlier about us being in a reciprocal epistemic relationship with the world. So we're shaping the world is shaping us, and so on. And so for me, when I came to the US, I was introduced to transformative justice. How can we address harm and how can we restore ourselves without relying on the same systems and the same structures that caused the harm to begin with? How can we heal our communities without relying on that harm? And it's not just a matter of restoring ourselves to the original conditions, because if the original conditions were unjust, what are we restoring ourselves to? And so I'm thinking about intersectionality, and intersectionality, of course, is a framework that accounts for multiple axes of power that intersect to compound and inform particularly Black women's experiences with discrimination. But there's also the tension that intersectionality also has its origins with the legal system in its fight for juridical legibility for Black women, which is also part of the same discourse of liberal feminism, of inclusion within frameworks that are inherently harmful, frameworks that are designed to exclude inherently. And so I feel like there's a rot that festers within a framework like that. And I'm talking about the criminal legal system and criminal justice system, which has criminalized Blackness for so many years from its inception, right? And so when we continue to include people into a system like that, and then we celebrate representation, we celebrate recognition, but the rot doesn't get better with diverse representation. And so I feel like it can only collapse under all of that weight. And I feel like it's a collapse, not in the sense that, we're saying, yeah, we got rid of the system, but rather like the artifice of magnanimity and goodwill falls away. So we often end up with, yes, diverse groups of people who were previously discriminated against and excluded, reproducing the exact same harms that we were trying to get away from to begin with. And so that's part of the problem that I have with equality and inclusion within systems that are causing harm, because we end up reproducing that same harm. So it doesn't go far enough is what I think I'm getting at.
And I think in a way, one thing that sometimes we don't always focus on is the work of grassroots organizations, right? They don't always get taken up as, doing the loftiest thing, because they may be concentrated in a particular neighborhood or by a particular class of people. But there are so many across the region that I think are very much so intentionally doing this work to support women, to support queer communities, to foster gender justice in integral ways. So I mentioned Red Thread earlier, Code Red, I Am a Girl Barbados. There's so many that I could really point to in terms of the work being done. But I also wanted, of course, for you to make space to talk more about Intersect and the work that you do as well.
Of course. And to add to some of those names, there's also Feminit and Caribbean Feminists are some of the more recent Caribbean feminist organizations doing incredible work. And so, yeah, Intersect Antigua was formed in 2015 by Anika Nicholas and myself. And it kind of started like in its inchoate stages. It was like consciousness raising. And so we were basically, to reference your earlier point about the internet and the digital revolution, it's because of the internet that Intersect is here today. And so Anika and I, we would have these conversations online on Facebook Messenger back in the day. And then we added more people to our little group chat. And then we had a Facebook group where we had people talking about all of these issues. And then we would get invited to collaborate with the Directorate of Gender Affairs. We hosted a rally in the heart of St. John's for 16 days of activism to raise awareness about human trafficking, to raise awareness about sexual harassment, to raise awareness about domestic violence, and so on and so forth. We conducted feminist teach-ins with students at the Antigua State College, with high school students at the Antigua Girls High School, my alma mater. It was just the two of us. And then eventually, I had to go off to school, and there was a lull in the work that we did. And so for a time, we weren't really doing much outside of, posting to our Facebook page. And then, we came together once more to talk about where we wanted to take Intersect. And so we applied for a grant. That's the Women's Voice and Leadership Caribbean program. And through that, we got the grant, thankfully, and we were able to launch a website called Intersect Antigua, where we curated over 150 Caribbean feminist stories, essays, poems, art, photography on 6 different themes that include mental health, carnival bodies, gender-based violence. That's This Is Not Love. That's the theme under which gender-based violence fell topically, and several other themes. Colorism is another one, and so on. And we had no idea how many submissions that we would get, but so many people submitted their pieces to us, and we, of course, couldn't do it on our own. So we had other Antiguans join the team. And they're all people that we know between myself and Anika, 3 of which were my former students. So I taught literature at the Antigua State College, and I taught literature at St. Anthony's Secondary School. They had an A-level department. And one of them is an artist, Lem. And so if you go onto our website, intersectantigua.com, the art that you see is her art. And Lem is just incredible. She's amazing, and we're so very lucky to have her on our team. But everyone on the team is brilliant and incredible and really passionate about the work.
Beautiful, thank you. I also wanted to, I forgot one, to uplift the Caribbean Association for Feminist Research and Action. They date back to the 1980s. When you think of Caribbean feminist research, scholars like Rhoda Reddick, Joan French, Honor Ford Smith, of course, the list can go on and on. Those are just some people who I think have been critical in terms of not just feminist action, but also feminist scholarship as well, which I will link, of course. Many of their articles and books and things that I've read that have been integral to my understanding of Caribbean women's history as, one that is cemented and grounded in women really, as I stated earlier, making those rebellious acts in whatever shape that they take as well.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned Rhoda Reddock, because she was also one of the instructors at the Caribbean Institute for Gender Development. And so if anybody who's listening in, you're in the Caribbean, you can apply to be a participant of the Caribbean Institute for Gender Development. And I met Rhoda Reddock there. She taught one of the courses with Tracy Robinson, Gabrielle Hossein, and so on. And it was phenomenal. It was very, very formative for me in my feminist journey.
Here we are at nearing the end of our discussion. So, as one of our final discussion points, what are your thoughts just around the future of Caribbean feminism and women's rights, and how do you think people should support feminism in the region?
I like this question. I want to situate myself and remind you that I am currently not in the Caribbean region. And by you, I mean the audience. And so I'm in New York, and I commute to Rutgers, where I'm currently doing my doctoral research, but I still have really strong connections to the region. And so a lot of what I'm about to say is perhaps not completely contemporary, because I haven't been living in Antigua for a few years. But I will say that based on what I've seen from what I know when I was living in the Caribbean, and what I'm seeing through my connections with people who are on the ground there, I think that some of the directions are extensions of the same. And so we have a lot of people who are, going to the UN and UN based conferences, going to CEDA to advocate for women's rights and gender equality and gender justice and so on. They're reporting on their country's progress to realizing these goals and so on. And then other directions are not so well trodden, one of which is the fact that there are more funding opportunities for Caribbean women's movements than there were before. And so the Women's Voice and Leadership Caribbean program is one such funding opportunity. And they're funding so many Caribbean feminist collectives and organizations throughout the region. And if you were to go onto their website, you can look at the sheer list of grantees, and they include, Indigenous Caribbean feminist organizations in South America. They include Caribbean feminist organizations committed to sex work and sex work liberation and so on and so forth. I mentioned the funding specifically because we're sitting with the tension of being folded into unpaid movement work, activist work, and getting burnt out, and being funded in some instances by organizations that participate in the same market economies under capitalism that we criticize. And so on the one hand, we want to be able to support our communities on the ground. We want to be remunerated for our work. We don't want to, expend all of this labor and not be able to survive. And so more funding agencies are not just funding projects. And so sometimes you would apply for grants and, the grant money only goes toward the project, but the people who are doing the labor don't get anything. And so they're also recognizing the need that, yes, the community projects need to be funded, but people need to be compensated. People need to have insurance. There needs to be more security and less precarity in the movement work that we're doing. But we don't want to reproduce that same, system of work under capitalism. And so how can we sit with that tension with where money is being invested, where it's coming from, and how we want that money to help the work that we're doing?
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. I agree. I think, when we consider labor and care work and all of the work that we've been talking about throughout this entire episode, we still need to survive and thrive in our efforts to make the world a better place. If it's the grants, but also if it's for our listeners out there, people just finding ways to support a lot of the organizations, whether you are in the diaspora or not. As we said, we can all be connected in this digital age. So I definitely co-sign that point and think that, for our listeners tuning in, find a way. There's always a way to support. So as we know, final question, my favorite question. And I'm very interested to hear your take on this because it could go several different ways. But what are your favorite examples of how, Caribbean women's stories show up in contemporary history and popular culture?
So I don't know. This is probably very, very predictable of me for the listeners tuning in who know me. And so I want to mention again, because I mentioned her before, Jamaica Kincaid and her book, A Small Place, as well as the autobiography of my mother. But if anyone wants to read Jamaica Kincaid's work, she has a piece called Girl in the New Yorker, which you can access for free. And it's a really, really powerful take on gender and coloniality. But Kincaid in particular, I'm always talking about her.
You have to rep. I'm not mad at it. You have to rep. For our listeners who don't know, she's from Antigua.
Yes, yes, thank you. Yes. So yes, Jamaica Kincaid is from Antigua. She's an Antiguan American author. And unfortunately, I mean, it's getting better, but she's not widely celebrated and loved in Antigua. And it's something I wrote about in one of my graduate papers, the fact that she is unloved by and large. When you compare other Caribbean literary figures who are lauded, who are lionized in their countries, Jamaica Kincaid, we're all mum in Antigua. And again, it's getting better. More people are reading her. But like one of the things I wrote about is the fact that she's lambasted for her anger in her text. Like she's seen as too angry, quote unquote, and her characters are not very likable, according to people who are reading her work. And I wrote that like her anger has no immediate utility that can serve political or nationalist ends. And so people want her to transmute her anger into a politic of nation building. And so we often hear people say, oh, well, she's airing our dirty laundry, but what did she do for Antigua? What was her contribution to Antigua? And so there's this critique that intends to fold her into this nationalist nation building project that she can never talk bad about Antigua. And also the fact that her characters are so unlikable and ungovernable, but the fact that they're unlikable and ungovernable is linked to the fact that they are deemed unfit to reproduce the nation. And M. Jackie Alexander talks about that a lot in her work. And so they don't have wombs, quote unquote, that can be instrumentalized for nation building, which is part of the reason why some people despise her texts so much. And so two questions I pose in this paper are, what does it mean to position Kincaid's anger as a starting point of discourse? And what effects do we conjure by positioning history as secondary to this anger? And so we were talking about history. And, when we look at the history of Antigua and Barbuda, we have to start there. We have to know why it is we are the way we are, why we do the things we do, why the things happen to us happened, to understand Kincaid's anger. But instead, we start with Kincaid's anger. Oh, why is she so angry? Why are her characters like this? And we deem history as a second. And so when you read A Small Place, when you read Girl, you understand where this anger is coming from. And so, yeah, that's exactly where I want to leave our listeners. Please read Jamaica Kincaid or reread her. If, like many people I grew up with, our first encounters with Kincaid were very tense. In some instances, people were taught to dislike the work. But now people in my age group are going back and discovering what a rebellious spirit both Kincaid and her characters have that propels the movement of Caribbean feminisms and Caribbean feminist liberation.
Truly, and those are actually probably two of my favorite books, definitely A Small Place and The Autobiography of Your Mother. So I also co-sign. I mean, I think that's one of the things about literature. I think there are so many pieces we can point to in terms of Caribbean women's voices in our literature. So I'm sure there will be a long list that I will add for our listeners to check out if you are interested. I mean, Sarah Ann, thank you so much for joining me for this episode. It was actually one of my favorites so far. So I hope you had a great time. I hope our listeners enjoyed and learned a bit more about Caribbean feminism and Caribbean women's history.
I did. Thank you so much for having me. And please, everybody, check us out at intersectantigua.com. Follow us on Twitter at intersect_ANU or on Instagram at intersect.anu, and read our amazing Caribbean feminist stories that we have curated from around the region and the diaspora.
Definitely, yes. I will link Intersect Antigua as well in our show notes. It'll be easy for you all to find. I will link again all the things that we talked about in our show notes, and we hope you enjoyed this episode. Look more, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspodcast.com for more information from each episode. Follow us at Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook, and at Strictly Facts PD on Twitter.